Revenge in the Americas. Over the previous 300 to 400 years of oppression, brutality, and enslavement, the Africans were starting bit by bit, the enslaved Africans bit by bit was starting to gain hope and momentum for the hope of freedom. The slavers had attempted to break the Africans into submission. They wanted the Africans to forget who they were and abandon any measure of self-esteem that they may have had. But throughout this period of history, we shall see how the desire for freedom is an innate desire which cannot be suppressed. Interestingly enough, the inspiration for freedom may have started in Europe. The enslaved Africans drew inspiration for the European fight for freedom and liberty. The French were cutting the heads off of their monarchy. In 1789, a revolt had started in France which would last a decade. After years of austerity due to the French monarchy fighting expensive wars in the Americas and other ventures, the crown was broke, the state was bankrupt, and the people or the public were starving as a result. They revolted against the monarchy and coined the principles Liberté, égalité, and fraternité, which translates into freedom, equality, and brotherhood. They decapitated their royal family and laid the foundations for a democracy before Napoleon Bonaparte took dictatorship via coup. The French Empire's most profitable territory at the time was Haiti in the Caribbean. At the time, it was called Saint-Domingue. The enslaved Africans on the island heard of France's fight for freedom and equality and held a voodoo ceremony. Voodoo is a religion which has its roots in West Africa and is still practiced today. During the ceremony, the voodoo priestess spoke of a messiah who would lead the enslaved Africans to overthrow their European oppressors to earn their freedom. Toussaint Louverture, a free man, rose to the call and led the enslaved Africans in battle against the French. Toussaint Louverture was a complicated man. He was freed by the age of 33 after being born into slavery, and reportedly owned a plantation and a slave who worked the plantation. African plantation owners were very uncommon. Most Africans would buy their freedom or be born into freedom if of the small amount which were born into freedom. And these were obviously on very rare occasions. Many consider Toussaint Louverture to be a very intelligent and a very shrewd man and an extremely well accomplished business owner. At the age of 50, 17 years after he was freed, he joined the fight for freedom. Toussaint Louverture first fought the Spanish against the French. He fought for the Spanish against the French, so he was very good at playing both sides. The Spanish wanted to conquer Haiti, and Toussaint Louverture helped the Spanish defeat the French. He then fought for the French against the Spanish and Great Britain, so he then sided with the French to fight for the French against Spain and Great Britain, and then finally he fought on behalf of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, in the era of Napoleonic France. He defeated Spain, Britain, France, and Napoleon Bonaparte's own army. Toussaint Louverture successfully led the previously enslaved Africans on the island of Haiti to defeat the French, the British, the Spanish, and Napoleon Bonaparte. Toussaint Louverture was bilingual at a time when it was illegal for Africans in the Americas to learn to read and write. Throughout the history of slavery and colonization, there is a themed power struggle to keep the Africans uneducated. We shall see that Toussaint Louverture, Samuel Sharp, Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and James Baldwin, all instrumental in the fight for freedom, were extremely well-educated people. Toussaint Louverture and his carefully selected fellow generals overthrew their oppressors and set up a democracy in its place. This is the first time in recorded human history that a nation of slaves had overthrown their oppressor and created a democracy as a result. Toussaint Louverture ate very little, often survived on fruit, less than 4 hours sleep, and often rode over 100 miles a day on horseback to stay ahead of his army. He often rode in front of his men to scope the land for potential threats and opportunities. Toussaint Louverture was a fantastic negotiator, often playing common enemies against each other and allying for the provision of guns. As we saw, he has fought with the French and the Spanish, against the French and the Spanish and the British, and of course Napoleon Bonaparte's own army. Now this is a quote from Lemonnier Delegasso in his memoirs. But what men these blacks are, how they fight and how they die. One has to make war against them to know how their reckless courage in braving anger when they can no longer have resources to stratagem. I have seen a solid column torn by grape shot from 4 pieces of cannon advance without making a retrograde step, i.e. they kept moving forward. The more they fell, the greater they seemed to encourage the rest. They advanced, signing for the Negro sings. They advanced singing for the Negro sings everywhere, makes songs on everything. This was once again by Lemonnier Delegasso. We also see that as Napoleon Bonaparte and as the French monarchy at the time started to ramp up the punishments for rebellion, we actually see an increase in effort by the Africans. So basically, whilst they were being threatened with severe punishments for their unruliness, they were essentially so broken by the thought of going back in chains, or they were so motivated to overthrow slavery that it made them fight harder. Even when the enemies of the revolutionaries upped the severity of the punishments for the Africans fought even harder. They had reached their limit. For them, a life of enslavement was worse than death. Toussaint Louverture realized the need for international trade for Haiti. He travelled to France, where he was tricked by officials, and he was then imprisoned in eastern France, where he died of pneumonia in 1803. His comrade, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, retaliated and killed every Frenchman on the island. Napoleon Bonaparte wrote to the Haitians and instructed them to pay reparations for their freedom to compensate for the loss of property of their masters. If they didn't pay, Napoleon Bonaparte would invade with full force to enslave them. The Haitians didn't finish paying these reparations until 1947. The French also forced the Haitians to export their produce at a 50% discount. Haiti led the fight for emancipation of enslaved Africans, but is the poorest country in the Caribbean today. So what we're seeing here is, yes, the Haitians won their freedom. The African Caribbeans, the African Haitians won their freedom. But Napoleon, in retaliation, after he was defeated by Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture, wanted to recapture the island, and he basically gave the Haitians an ultimatum. Either they have to fight against the entire onslaught of the Napoleonic French army, or they pay reparations for their freedom. And they did not. They took the latter, so they paid reparations for their freedom, which was such a huge amount that they didn't finish paying it off until 1947, despite Toussaint Louverture dying 144 years previous to this. Not just this, but they had to sell their produce or their exports cheap to the French. My task to you. Toussaint Louverture was a slave owner and a plantation owner. Many would describe him as an unsavory character. However, he laid the foundations for the emancipation of slavery in the Americas and Africa. Likewise, Winston Churchill is linked to the Bengali famine, which killed 3 million people, and said, this is what Winston Churchill said, "I am strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes, and I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, has basically defeated them." When leaders have provided a lot of good but also have committed many atrocities, how should we remember them? How should we celebrate them? Should we celebrate them? How does this differ to what we have, which is cancel culture? Now, the reason why I'm asking this, I'm not in any way comparing Toussaint Louverture to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was, in my opinion, the propagator of far more unjust harm than Toussaint Louverture ever could have been or ever could have done. However, we do have a bit of a paradox. We have these individuals who arguably have given great service to the people in which they govern and which they control, who they lead, but these individuals have two sides to them. Looking back at them from our modern ethical stance, we might see them as unsavoury. Do we see them do we therefore cancel them entirely? Do we write them out of our history books? Or do we appreciate them as complex individuals? Or do we, for example, separate the good from the bad? I want you to tell me I want you to discuss as a class how you think we should celebrate these individuals from history, or should we celebrate them at all? How should we remember them? Do we take out the bad or include the bad as well as the good? And of course, discuss under the guidance of your teacher, and whenever you're ready, we can continue with the presentation.